Hello everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Adrian Lloyd, this is just my stupid opinion. I want to start off today talking about the terrorist attack that went down in New York on Halloween night, Tuesday, October 31st. So what ended up happening is one crazy Islamic fuck he rented a car and went on a killing spree. He ended up leaving 8 people dead at the end of it, and I think by now there was at least 12 people that were injured in the attack, although the numbers may be a little bit higher than that. The attack took place pretty damn close to the World Trade Center, and this one has been the most deadly terror attack in New York since 9/11. He ended up running down some cyclists, which I believe was where most of the deaths ended up coming from, and then afterwards he continued on his rampage, which he ended up slamming into a school bus. He ended up injuring 4 inside the bus, 2 children and 2 adults. But as far as we've been told, there were no serious injuries from that. And then after he had ran into the bus, he ended up getting out, he brandished some weapons, and he ended up screaming out, "Allahu Akbar, Allah is greatest." In terms of the attack on the cyclists, the vehicle entered the pedestrian bike path at Houston Street, a few blocks north of Chambers Street at Manhattan West Side. The truck drove down the bike path for about 4 blocks, striking cyclists and pedestrians before veering back into traffic lanes and striking a school bus and another vehicle. The suspect emerged brandishing what police called imitation firearms. A pellet gun and a paintball gun were recovered from the scene, NYPD Commissioner James O'Neill said. An officer shot him in the abdomen and he was transported to the hospital. O'Neill said statements that the suspects made and the nature of the attack led investigators to believe it was an act of terror. He did not specify what those statements were. He ended up receiving surgery in order to save his life. So he will face trial over this. 6 people were pronounced dead at the scene and 2 others died at the hospital, officials said. At least 11 others suffered injuries that were described as serious. New York Presbyterian Lower Manhattan Hospital said it had treated 3 patients from the critical condition, 3 in fair conditions, and 2 in good condition. What couldn't be foreseen was the fact that many of the victims weren't actually American citizens. The Belgian government reported that one of their citizens, a woman, was killed at the scene, while 3 other of their natives were injured. As well as this, there were 5 Argentinian men who were in New York in order to celebrate their 30th anniversary since they graduated high school, but they ended up dying in this attack. After the attack took place, CBS News reported that the suspect was Saifullo Habibullaevic Saipov, a 29-year-old truck driver who lived in Tampa, Florida, and New Jersey. He came to the U.S. in 2010 from Uzbekistan. I decided for this I wasn't going to advertise the face of the killer because I feel like this is one of the things that spurs on more to do it, is the fame behind it. So I decided just to blank it out and only give information on the suspect for how it relates to the fact, because there's no point in giving this crazy fuck a platform for him. So we know who he is, and sources tell CBS News senior investigator producer Pat Milton the suspect yelled Allahu Akbar, Arabic for God is great, when he exited the truck. It actually stands for either God is greater or Allah is greater. I'm going to get into this in just a minute. A federal law enforcement source said a note was found in the suspect's truck that made reference to ISIS. This has been a little unsure as to what it was, because some are saying it was a note to ISIS written in Arabic, some are saying it was a note pledging allegiance to ISIS in English, and others are claiming it was an ISIS flag. But either way, we have some correlation back to ISIS, and ISIS itself has even claimed credit for it. As Newsweek reported, it turned out that after the attack took place, many social media accounts that were either ISIS themselves or in support of ISIS ended up celebrating the attack. One ISIS supporter ended up writing "Trick or Tweet New York City," adding a happy face image after the attack. Another ended up writing Allahu Akbar. In terms of our shooter, Saipov, he doesn't seem to really have an aggressive background checked on him. So right now, law enforcement officials are looking into it, including the FBI, and we'll see what we find. But as it stands, we don't really know much about this guy. While we do have a connection between our shooter to ISIS, many media outlets are reporting that this is a lone wolf attack. And this seems to be true. It seems that this guy was most likely somebody who was radicalized in America and then was inspired by them in order to go out and do an attack like this. These sort of attacks are not uncommon have seen them all the time, especially they've really ramped up over the last year, and they're typically done by citizens who have been radicalized. And since they may not have access to a lot of weapons, and really a car is a much more effective weapon in doing a mass killing like this than a gun, depending on where it's taking place. In most situations, running down a crowd really would be one of the best ways to do an act of terrorism. But it does, yes, seem to be a lone wolf attack. This is even what police are saying about the situation now. So more information is going to come out over the next couple days, and we'll get a better understanding as to what really took place. Seems pretty obvious, the motive, but more about who this guy is. I'm filming this on the 1st of November, so the attack took place yesterday for me. This will probably get posted on the 2nd, so we may have more information by then. One argument that's actually going around right now, which I kind of feel to me is splitting hairs. I first saw it reported when I was reading an article in the Daily Wire. Anyway, this article says CNN falsely claims that terrorists said God is great instead of Allahu Akbar. While it is true that a lot of the media outlets, CNN and many on the left, are reporting that he said God is great, which in itself seems to be a mistake, as it's supposed to say God is greater or Allah is greater, since they seem to distinguish, so it's most likely Allah is greater. Which might just be a direct Allah is greater than your Christian God or your Jewish God, possibly. But a lot of people on the right have picked this up and have started commenting on it about how they are misreporting it. Maybe it's just because I'm not religious, but to me just seems like this is splitting hairs. But if I did hold a religion, I might view this a little bit differently. It's just something I've seen over Twitter. It seems to be, along with everything, it seems to be one of the big ones that people on the right are picking up on, just that CNN and all these other media outlets have reported that God is great. And I even read from one that said God is great. My cat wouldn't leave me alone, so he's joining me for the podcast. So it is pretty widespread, though, right now that the media is reporting God is great rather than Allahu Akbar. Once again, I think this is splitting hairs. I'd be curious to see what you all think on it, so feel free to comment below and let me know what you think about this whole thing. And we need to be honest, this is another individual who's been radicalized in order to pull a terrorist attack like this. And I do believe that it comes from the ideology, from the religion. However, despite this, one thing that again has been going around, which bugs me, is that they're just targeting every Muslim in general. This is not just on the right, it's also on the left. It just seems to be a lot of people and their stereotypes they have. I was actually speaking to a friend about this at the bar like a week ago, maybe not even, before the attack took place. And we were discussing about the niqab ban that happened in Quebec. And one thing that I find is that while it is more common for Muslims to get radicalized through their ideology, I find that Western Muslims, people who have been born here and raised here, are less likely to do this. Now, that's not completely true. There are some times where we do have born and raised Americans or Canadians that go out and do this under the Islamic ideology. But generally, when I do hear about these attacks, they're coming from people who have recently moved from the Middle East. This is where I find the real problem comes from. It's not really that it's just an all-around Muslim problem. I find that it has to do more with location of where these people come from. And this isn't just restricted to Islam. This seems to be a fundamental thing in religion. There are places where you go and you will find more fundamental Christians or more fundamental Jews, and their practices vary differently. Even if we look at the polls that have some people have concerned people, I mean, I'll throw them up here in just a second. The Pew polls that have been cited many times, which shows just how radical views Muslims can hold. If we look at them too, while there are some places they are high, very few of them actually appear in Western countries. And these are generally, seems to be a Middle Eastern problem. So location tends to matter when you're trying to get somebody radicalized. But the religion, allows people to be radicalized for what it says in it. We need to be honest, ISIS isn't exploiting the word. ISIS is using the word to their advantage. It's a common religious tactic, really. It just concerns me because I have noticed a narrative where it has to be all Muslims. And one is that any Muslim who doesn't believe these things isn't a real Muslim. Well, there's a lot of things Christians and Jews don't believe in, but they're still Christians and Jews. This is actually seems to be a very common place that takes place in religion, is that you start phasing out all the bad shit from your religion. So these are the Muslims that really do make a difference. So these are the Muslims that should be in the lead of the community, because they could lead a reformation of Islam, especially one in the Middle East where it's really needed. It's just to judge somebody in a blanket statement like that, and it's not just for religion, but just in general, to just precast everybody underneath a certain umbrella is really one of the first signs of prejudice. And I'm not a guy that even likes to bring that up, like anything to do with sexism or racism, for how much it gets thrown around these days. Usually I'm just mocking it whenever it comes up. But that is literally the first definition of prejudice, which is something that a lot of people pointed to people on the left of doing, putting blanket statements on people, and that's their claim for the racist left. While this is true, I've also seen it on the right. But this is actually one of the biggest problems we're having right now. It's that everybody is being reined into these categories, and they're obligated to act and think a certain way under these categories. This is just another way to do it. That being said, there's a lot of terrible shit that is in the Quran. There's a lot of terrible shit that has been used to justify bad things in the Islamic religion. This is just more proof of that, of how it's being used in this way, about what is in the word. Christians a while ago had to do this, because if they kept following the literal word of the Bible, we would still be in a pretty shitty place in the West. But at one point, the Christians decided that there were things they had to leave into the past. And this is what Islam has to do. There are things inside the Quran which needs to be left behind. The problem is, for a lot of Muslims, their belief is that it is the final word of God, so nothing can be altered. So if nothing can be altered, then nothing can be left in the past. And this is the problem we're having today with radical Islam. But from there, we're going to move into our news story. So, some of you may have seen by now, some of you maybe might not, but did you know that the Black Death is back? Yes, the terrible plague that killed millions of people back in, I believe it was the 14th century, has returned, and it's been seen in Madagascar. And health experts are warning of a global outbreak of Black Death as plague continues to spread. So far there have been about 1,300 cases of pneumonic plague, which is transmitted by air, and they have now been confirmed. And now the deadly disease has spread into more African countries after taking root in Madagascar. Countries affected include South Africa, Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Comoros, the Seychelles, Mauritius, and Reunion. I'm just going to level now. I have never heard of those last three countries. So we have 1,300 confirmed cases, and of those, 124 people have been killed. My cat's biting me. The World Health Organization, which is working with Madagascar's Ministry of Health, has warned that the risk of the epidemic spreading is high. This thing is vicious. This thing is vicious. It's unbelievable. She's biting me while I'm trying to podcast. Okay. Bye, Luna. Vicious cat. And on top of this, we're being told that while it can't be explained, the plague is different somehow. But they don't explain anything in this. I know they say they can't explain it, but they don't give us any indication onto how it's different. Has it killed more people? It seems like more people got infected. In what way does it seem different? They just say, we can't explain it, but it's different. Well, you can at least tell us what differences you've observed, instead of just leaving us in suspense like this about the Black Plague. So the language used here just seems very fishy to me, I'll say. In some way, they should be able to explain it to us in how it is different, yet they are refusing to clarify. And it seems to me like it's this emphasis on disease that we see. We see it every year or two where the media tends to freak out over something. The last time we saw this, I would believe, was in 2015, and that was during the Ebola outbreak, where officials were screaming about how bad it was going to be, and then we get 1-2 cases in America? And I don't think either of them died, if I remember correctly. So I actually believe it's another one of these cases that it's going to be a lot of hype over it, a lot of freak out, and we're going to see very little, and we're going to see next to nothing happen. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. First, let's look into the bubonic plague. There are 3 types of plague. Bubonic, affecting the lymph nodes, and that's the classic you'll see in the movies where they get the boils and everything, and it seems like the skin is just eating itself apart, like it's almost a flesh eating disorder. This is the one that usually typically gets broadcasted by Hollywood. Then we also have septicemia, which causes bleeding under the skin. And then we have pneumonic, which affects respiration, and which is airborne. It can travel through air. The World Health Organization describes the pneumonic plague as the deadliest and most rapid form of plague, which generally a airborne plague is, especially when you're living in a community that has a lot of people living in very close quarters, as many African countries do. So it would allow the disease to spread very quickly, which is probably one of the main reasons that we see such a large outbreak so far. Well, 1,300 people. They are expecting it to get bigger, though. So as we look more into this and we look into the plague, some of the key facts is the plague is caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, a zoonotic bacteria usually found in small animals and their fleas. People infected with Yersinia pestis often develop symptoms after an incubated period of 1 to 7 days. Plague is transmitted between animals and humans by the bite of infected fleas, direct contact with infected tissue, and inhalation of infected respiratory droplets. Plague can be a very severe disease in people, with a case fatality ratio of 30% to 60% for the bubonic type, and is usually fatal to the pneumonic kind when left untreated. Antibiotic treatment is effectively against plague bacteria, so early diagnosis and early treatment can save lives. From 2010 to 2015, there were 3,248 cases reported worldwide, including 584 deaths. Currently, the 3 most endemic countries are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, and Peru. As for the symptoms for this disease, bubonic plague is the most common form. Plague is caused by the bite of an infected flea. Plague Bacillus Yersinia pestis enters at the bite and travels through the lymphatic system to the nearest lymph nodes where it replicates itself. The lymph nodes then become inflamed, tense, and painful, and it is called a bubo. At advanced stages of the infection, the inflamed lymph nodes can turn into open sores filled with pus. Human-to-human transmission of bubonic plague is rare. Bubonic plague can advance and spread into the lungs, which can be more severe type of plague called pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague, or lung-based plague, is the most virulent form of plague. Incubation can be as short as 24 hours. Any person with pneumonic plague may transmit the disease via droplets to other humans. Untreated pneumonic plague, if not diagnosed and treated early, can be fatal. However, recovery rates are high if detected and treated in time, within 24 hours of onset of symptoms. When I say that I'm not concerned about the plague outbreak, it's because since I started my podcast, and actually very recently, I quit my job. It was beginning of September because I went back to school. Well, it just so happens that I used to work for a company called Thermo Fisher Scientific. It was a company owned by Oxoid. At this job, I literally made products for diseases like this. At my old job, Thermo Fisher, we made petri dishes filled with a substance called agar. And what we did is we'd make these and we shipped these to medical clinics, doctor's offices all around North America. And they're also Thermo Fisher and Oxoid's worldwide, but our focus was here. So what these petri dishes were for was when you were sick with a disease, you go to the doctor's office and then they would maybe have to take a sample, swab, and then they would send it off for testing. Well, this would have been the start of that testing. For the most basic form of disease, Say you have a sore throat. This could be caused by whatever. Let's say it was bronchitis. The doctor would take a swab of your throat, and then they would cut off the tip of the Q-tip onto one of these petri dishes and leave it in incubation for a few days. Usually this was at a specific temperature. When I worked at Thermo Fisher, we took samples to make sure that our product was good because everything had to be sterile. So it did happen many times where maybe the plates or the product itself was contaminated, and then things would start to grow on there like mold. And then from what grows on there, we can tell what the disease is. So we would take these samples and then we'd leave them off in these incubators, which looked like fridges, only they were hot instead of cold. And I think actually because of my contract, I can't actually even tell what degree it was. I was definitely sworn to not telling interior secrets of the job. But they would be set at two different temperatures, about 10 degrees apart. But anyway, and then they would be in there for a day or two, and then they would be checked and tested to see if anything growed, and then would get sent off. This was exactly what would happen when you were sick. The sample, they would rub it on, and then they leave it for incubation, see what grows on it, and then they could tell the disease. Well, Yersinia was literally one of the products we used to make shit for. I'm not kidding you. Well, Yersinia actually just so happened to be one of the products that we made our stuff for. It was called Yersinia Selective Agar. Now, our product specifically, while this bubonic plague checked for Yersinia pestis, ours used to check for Yersinia enterocolytica. So this would be an earlier form of testing that they would use in order to check for if it had anything to do with the Yersinia product. However, to be more specific, a serology test would be necessary in order to tell which Yersinia strain it really was. So, from working at my job, I know what we test for, and I also know that the Yersinia strain, the plague, is not the danger it used to be. Now, I'm not saying that it's not dangerous. As stated, if you go without medical treatment, you will die. However, Western medicine is pretty damn good these days that we can treat anybody that has the plague pretty damn effectively. It's mostly just antibiotics these days. For the most part, there's a little more to it, but that really is your main treatment. So if, should we say, the worst is to happen and the plague was to get out and start spreading, I don't believe it actually would spread very far. Because of my past experiences in the company, I know what we test for. I know how effective our product is, and I know how effective our medicine is to combat it. That's why I'm not concerned of an outbreak over here. One reason it is outbreaking in Africa is because their medicine isn't as good as ours. Especially in these poor countries, they don't have the medicine necessary, the antibiotics, to fight off diseases. But more than anything, that's why I believe that this is just media hype. That we are going to see outbreaks and cases such as with the Ebola crisis that happened 2-3 years ago. But I seriously guarantee it's going to be anticlimactic. The media is acting like we're about to see the second Black Plague, that we're going to see millions of people die, maybe even to the billions. That's the way they're acting. So don't fall for the hype. I'm really sorry if you happen to be watching this from somewhere in Africa, because you seem like you're kind of screwed. But for most people who are watching this, you're pretty safe. You don't really have to worry about catching the Black Plague if you're in the West or a continent away. There may be outbreaks, you may hear of some, but if anything is to happen, get your ass to a doctor as soon as possible, and I promise you, you will be okay. Should I be wrong, I will come on here and make sure that I state that I am wrong. But I don't think I am. Officials do believe that they figured out how the outbreak happened, though. An article got released by thesun.uk and ended up saying that Dancing with Death, plague is spreading because relatives are digging up their Black Plague dead and dancing with the corpses as part of ancient Madagascan ritual called Famadihana. Madagascans have been told to stop the tradition practice of Famadihana, which sees locals dig up deceased relatives and dance with them before they are reburied. It is feared the ceremony has helped spread an outbreak of pneumonic plague that has left more than 120 dead on the African island. The country's health chief, Willie Randrimarotia, said, quote, "If a person dies of pneumonic plague and is then interred in a tomb that is subsequently opened for a famadihana, the bacteria can still be transmitted and contaminate whoever handles the body," end quote. The tradition has been banned since the outbreak began, but it is feared ceremonies have taken place regardless. Some locals are openly dismissing the advice. They're saying that this is the cause of the outbreak, and even though I've told people over in the West not to be concerned, people in Africa should be concerned. And they're completely ignoring the advice due to, what, tradition? Is this religion? I'm not sure. Probably more tradition, I think, than religion, but I think this is a tradition that needs to be left behind because it seems like a form of grave robbing to me. Even though you're putting the bodies back, you're still digging them up. Can't we just let the dead rest? Just let them rest in peace. You don't need to dig them up for some ceremony. Worst comes to worst and you really have to honor them, then go to their graves and honor them. But don't dig them up. What are you guys doing? Even if it's not the Black Plague we're worried about, there are a shit ton of diseases that come with dead bodies. You would get something out of it. Most likely. So just don't. Please, for all our sakes, just don't. So the next story I wanted to talk about was a video that Tim Pool came out with not too long ago, a couple days ago. So the first video was a little bit shorter. It was called "I Just Got Mauled by Antifa." And the second one was Antifa versus Cernovich at Columbia. So he was covering a rally where Mike Cernovich was speaking at Columbia University. He was mostly speaking about right-wing media and alternative media and why it's become so relevant in today's society. But it received a lot of protesters. But there were a lot of protesters there. And while I was watching the video, I saw something interesting. I have the audio here from the video and a few pictures to go along with it during the event. But you don't need to see it in order to understand. You just listen.
Stand for! In response to the national outcry. In response to the national outcry. Over this massacre. Over this massacre. White nationalists. White nationalists. Like Cernovich. Like Cernovich. Tweeted. Tweeted. Spare us. Spare us. The sanctimony. The sanctimony. Cernovich's claims. Cernovich's claims. Of white genocide. Of white genocide. Were echoed by Root. Were echoed by Root. Who said during the shooting. That black Americans are raping our women, and taking over our country. He is supporting murderers like Dylan Root, like James Alex Fields Jr. Who murdered someone in Charlottesville. This year. If you believe that this is fucking bullshit. If you believe that Nazi fascist fucking scum should not be allowed on our campuses, or anywhere, if you believe that Black Lives Matter, then raise your fists in solidarity.
No Nazis, no KKK, no fascist USA! 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 No Nazis, no KKK, no fascist USA!
You may have heard what I heard, and that was that we had a guy at the front of this crowd, and as he spoke, every phrase he said, the crowd repeated back to him like drones. Like there were no individuals there. Like it was all part of a collective, a unimind. And it was a little bit creepy, really. Because it seems to me these are the type of activities we see in things like movies and TV shows when we see what was a real cult that is being brought to life in that show or movie, or whenever they've shown a fictional cult. They always seem zombified. They don't think for themselves. They only repeat what they've been told. And it seems very much that this is what was happening in this video during this event. In the second part of that video, later on in the event, we had some protesters that were just hanging around, kind of doing their thing, maybe talking a little bit amongst each other, maybe yelling at the supporters of Mike Cernovich. But then somebody starts a chant, and then they all just follow along monotonely. And one thing in the video, which you may not have been able to tell from the picture, is that most of the people in the crowd who were repeating it, they weren't there like getting all into it, like they really were passionate about everything. They were just kind of repeating it. Like, they didn't really care or were kind of like whatever, but they were just repeating it anyway. It seemed to me like almost like they had to. Like, if they didn't start chanting along with everybody else, they were going to get singled out. Not that they were scared, but more they were just like annoyed that another chant was coming, but they were still chanting. Or they just felt indifferent to the chant. And it just seemed like mindless drones to me. Is this what the left has become? That it's just a bunch of mindless drones appearing at these protests, just repeating what they've been told over and over and over again? It really does seem to me like this is the point we've come to. I mentioned before on the podcast that one of my favorite shows was Star Trek: The Next Generation. And for those who haven't seen the show, there's an alien race in there called the Borg, which are cyborg. They're half sentient life forms, half robot. And anyway, one of their most famous lines from the show, it's, "We are the Borg. Resistance is futile. Prepare for assimilation. If you do not comply, you will be destroyed." And this is what it reminded me of. They reminded me of the Borg from this show, because in this show, the Borg are just essentially mindless. They all share the same mind. They all share the same feeling. They all share the same emotion. I shouldn't really say emotion because they didn't really have emotions. But this is what their species had become. And this was a similarity that I saw from the show in this protest. They reminded me of the Borg, just sitting there monotonely repeating what they've been told to say. And it makes me a little more nervous about the left now. And again, I'm a guy who has more attachment to the left than the right. Pretty much my entire life I'd been on the left. With some right-wing leaning views, but for the most part, on the left. But I just don't want any association with the left anymore for this reason. There's still parts on the right that I don't want any association with, but this is why people have said that they feel like they didn't leave the left, but the left left them. Most famous person to say this would be Dave Rubin. I don't know if he was actually the first person to say that, but I know I definitely heard people starting to say that more and more after he said it on his show. And that's actually how I feel, because it was a very good quote, in that many people's political opinions haven't changed, but somehow they've watched as they're no longer considered on the left. I, for a few years, was in my echo chamber just watching TYT News and pretty much nothing else, so I, for a few years, was a little farther on the left, and I definitely had some views that changed to be a little more left-wing. But all in all, I've been a liberal for most of my life, with a brief stunt as a leftist. Maybe, 2-3 years. So this is why a lot of people, such as myself, feel that the left are the ones who have left us, because they've gotten more radical over the years, while the rest of us have just stayed put. So that was the first interesting part of that story, and then we come to the second part. There seemed to be a couple conspiracies flying around this event that Mike Cernovich was at. I first actually came across it when I was searching 4chan, I've recently started to get, I haven't really been on 4chan before, but because they've been making so many waves over the last few months, I've been getting on there underneath poll to see what's going on and maybe get some information. So this was actually where I first saw that. But then there's been a lot going on Twitter as well. And essentially, it was this photo that went up. So as we can see from the sign, which is being held by what appears to be Antifa members, we have no white supremacy, no pedo bashing, no Mike Cernovich, no pedo bashing. The sign clearly shows support for pedophilia. And the other thing that people point out, if you look at the bottom to the rainbow colored letters, that actually says NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. So this was seen by Antifa. And this was tweeted out by Mike Cernovich, and many people on the right picked it up, talking about how disgusting it is that Antifa is saying no pedo bashing. There's where things get interesting. However, what's interesting about this story is that another man tweeted out this photo claiming it was a right-wing plant. As the story goes, this guy, Jeff Offenhartz, was at the protests. And a couple guys came by with this poster rolled up and asked Antifa members to march with it. So they rolled it out without looking at what was written on it, and then the guys who gave it to him started taking photos. Eventually, somebody knows what the sign said and ripped it up, and the guys got chased off. So this guy ended up tweeting out that it was a right-wing plant, that right-wingers had done that in order to make the Antifa and the left look bad. He also made a claim because when this was seen, it went viral first because Mike Cernovich tweeted it out, showing that Antifa members were holding this sign. But this author, Jeff Offenhartz, says that Mike Cernovich didn't retweet him, just took the photo without the description of it being a right-wing plant and what happened, and just tweeted out the photo itself saying it was Antifa holding the sign. And as we look at these tweets, we can see that Mike Cernovich did not actually retweet it. He did just take the photo. He just says, NAMBLA sign at Columbia protest, these people are sick. When we look at the original tweet, Jake says, alt-right strikes first at Columbia, Cernovich event, plant NAMBLA brand, sign in front of protest. Now, in terms of this protest, Misty Denson, a Columbia graduate student who organized the protest, said the protest had approximately 250 attendees, many of whom the students did not recognize. Quote, there were a lot of faces we didn't recognize and a lot of people with their own signs with their own opinions, end quote, Denson told the Daily Beast. Well, she probably didn't recognize them because it was fucking Antifa showing up, and that happens all the time on protests these days. People come from all around, and you'll have a bunch of faces that you won't recognize from the school. And to be perfectly honest, at a university, I'm not expecting her to know every face there. So it's quite possible that most of them, or many of them, were just students, and she didn't realize. So we have the two sides. We have Mike Cernovich's side, which is claiming that this was Antifa itself marching with this sign. And then on the other side, we have this guy who's claiming that it was a right-wing plant in order to make Antifa and the rest of the left look bad by supporting pedophilia. Which one is it most likely? So as I've looked into this, I found there's some discrepancies with the left-wing story. Maybe discrepancies isn't the best way. The left-wing story is a lot weaker than the right-wing story is. See, on the right, it's the counter-protesters carrying a pro-pedophilia sign. It's Antifa people. While some have claimed that it was in fact right-wing people or trolls underneath the mask carrying the sign, I don't know if that's true, but they've been caught with it. So the onus is on Antifa to show that they were in fact not the ones carrying the sign. Because the evidence is in place, so they have to fight back against the evidence. And to me, the evidence is not good enough that they've presented. Because all they have to go on it, they don't have any video footage, so all we can hear is them saying it's a right-wing plant. Another one that was used as evidence is that the Antifa group based in New York ended up tweeting out that apparently the sign had the wrong Antifa logo on it, as we see here. And what they said is that their logo is two black flags, as we see here on the right, as in their logo on Twitter, while this is the one that was being presented, the red flag and the black one in the background. And they say that this is proof that it wasn't them because it shows that it's not their symbol. While it does seem to show a black and two black flags instead of the red and the black, this seems like a very menial thing to do because the red and the black is the most common Antifa flag that we do see around, rather than this completely black one used by the New York-based group. So to that, if that is your defense, that because they use a red flag instead of a black flag, that's still not good enough in my opinion. It may not be specific, but once again, it is still a very basic, it is still one of the most well-known flags, so I could easily see Antifa members carrying either one. I have seen Antifa carrying either one. So this doesn't convince me. My other problem with the left-wing story is that in his article where he accused Mike Cernovich of stealing his tweet, Often Hearts, he ended up saying, he then went on to slander Mike Cernovich more, which may just be more of his left-wing views as why he did it, but he did slander Mike Cernovich. He ends up calling him a rape apologist, a white nationalist, and a serial online harasser. So to me personally, it doesn't really help it that he's accusing Mike Cernovich of this. Whether you like Mike Cernovich or not, these are definitely ways to discredit him, even if some of the things he has said on these subjects have been definitely controversial. This is used as a way to discredit him before the story even really gets going. The other problem is that in the past, left-wing news and magazines have actually had a pro-pedophilia stance. A good example would be Salon, which has written a piece or two about how essentially that pedophilia shouldn't be treated as criminals, but treated as people with a disorder or sickness or something, but essentially being very lenient on them. The left has actually had a much softer approach to pedophilia than the right seems to have had in recent years, so this is again not working in the left's favor in terms of this story. It does seem weird though that Antifa would show up to protest using a pro-pedophilia sign. That does really seem weird to me. The other thing is the fact they used the NAMBLA. Because Vice News actually did a bit about this last year, where they were talking about what the hell happened in NAMBLA. We used to hear so much about them in the early to mid 2000s, and it's like, where'd they go? Well, in their article, they end up stating in here, NAMBLA, once a visible advocate for pedophilia, doesn't feature heavily into what I call the online pedosphere these days. Membership numbers and group activities are difficult to pin down, but based on online research and conversations with alleged former members as well as opponents of the group, both appear to have dwindled to nearly nothing. NAMBLA's membership meant the ability to socialize with other members at activist events and a subscription to the NAMBLA newsletter. NAMBLA's original political causes were the total abolition of any legal age of consent and the release of child molesters from prison. As an advocacy group, NAMBLA sought to turn sex between men and boys of literally all ages into a civil rights issue. Get pederasts to come out of the closet and show North America that boy lovers are people too. Kids, says NAMBLA, should be able to decide when and with whom they have sex.
We've been after you for a long time, buddy. Do you know your rights?
Rights? Does anybody know their rights? You see, I've learned something today. Our forefathers came to this country because they believed in an idea called freedom. They wanted to live in a place where a group couldn't be prosecuted for their beliefs, where a person can live the way he chooses to live. You see us as being perverted because we're different from you. People are afraid of us because they don't understand, and sometimes it's easier to persecute than to understand. Dude, you have sex with children. We are humans. Most of us didn't even choose to be attracted to young boys. We were born that way. We can't help the way we are, and if you all can't understand that, well, then I guess you'll just have to put us away. Dude, you had sex with children.
So as the story goes, on the left, we have an accusation. We have a picture of Antifa walking with pro-pedophilia sign, which also shows support for NAMBLA, which is being claimed that is a right-wing plant with very little information There doesn't seem to be any pictures of anybody running off, doesn't seem to be any video of anybody running off that I can find anyway. And their only defense is that the Antifa flag didn't match the New York-based one, the New York-based group, and that NAMBLA is pretty small time. On the other side, we have a picture that was tweeted out by Mike Cernovich where he didn't quote the guy before him stating that it was right-wing plant. But in terms of Mike Cernovich's side, he has a picture of the group protesting him holding the sign, so he's already presented the evidence necessary for him to present. So now it's up to Antifa and the left to present the evidence to show that it was in fact not them. Which is hard to do when you dress in black masks, but you know what? This sort of shit happens when you're going to be cowards and not show your face. That people are going to get sneaky and they're going to defame you like this, if that's what happened. I don't believe this being a right-wing plant. Not enough evidence has been presented for me to believe it. In fact, some even say that it was Cernovich himself who helped plant it, and in the poll conversation on 4chan that I saw, they were talking about even possibly rebel media having some involvement in this. So it's interesting, but I'm not sure if I actually do believe that this is a real plant. And for our final story, last weekend, there was a lot of anticipation for people on the left as it was reported that in the Russia case, there was finally going to be an indictment made. So over the weekend, a lot of people on the left were very excited about who was it going to be, who's the connection to Russia. And eventually, in the end, it turned out that it was Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort was Trump's ex-campaign manager, and I had actually spoken about him before on the podcast, back early when I started, and I don't think this is a video available on YouTube. When I first started, I did my own little investigation into the Russia probe, and in it, I did not find any direct correlation between Donald Trump and Russia, but there were people surrounding Trump that had weird connections to Russia. We had Michael Flynn, who was in the White House for all of a minute before he was cast out, and there was an investigation that was looking into his involvement with Russians, and it seemed there may have even been something there because even the military was running its own independent investigation into him. Then we had Roger Stone, who was a longtime supporter of Trump, and he seemed to himself to have a lot of business and connections to Russia. Maybe nothing there aside for business, but the fact that he was so close to the Trump campaign and the fact InfoWars played such a significant role for information during the campaign, a lot of people were wondering if there was something there. Even I thought that Roger Stone's relationship with InfoWars was kind of weird in that he seemed to be very involved with the Trump campaign, and Alex Jones was a big Trump supporter, yet he was on his show. So it seemed to me it would be the equivalent of Don Lemon going to advise Obama at the White House and then coming back to CNN to do the news at the end of the night, and there would just be a huge conflict of interest there. So I kind of saw that. And then finally we had Paul Manafort. That was the third guy I thought there was connection to. Although him was not necessarily directly. He had past connections with Russia. Paul Manafort used to be the campaign manager for Viktor Yanukovych. Viktor Yanukovych was the fourth prime minister of Ukraine, and he was the one in charge when the Ukrainian civil war broke out. He was very pro-Russian over America. That was the battle that was going on in that election back in 2010. It was a battle of influence, essentially. Was it going to be Russian influence or was it going to be American influence? One candidate supported America, one candidate supported Russia. In the end, Viktor Yanukovych got in. Some believed he got in under suspicious circumstances, that he may have possibly rigged the election, but nothing about that really solid has come up. So the connection has to do with the money that Manafort got while working as Viktor Yanukovych's campaign manager. And there's some nasty stories about Paul Manafort. In fact, there were some tweets that got released that were from between both his daughters. One daughter was texting the other one, and I believe it was his oldest daughter was making some pretty damning accusations about her father. See, there was a situation involved that, first off, she blamed her father for what was going on in Ukraine and believed he had a big hand in it being destabilized. But even more damning than that, there was an event that took place early on in the Ukraine protest before it developed into a full-blown civil war. There was an event where government forces ended up gunning down, I think it was like 19 or 20 protesters. And it was very highly criticized by the world, and eventually was one of the main tipping points to turn the country into civil war. Well, Paul Manafort's daughter in these tweets was making a lot of accusations about how her father knew about the event, that it was going to take place, and in fact even said that she believed that her father had a big hand in it taking place, going as far to suggest that he may have planted the idea inside Viktor Yanukovych's head in order to do this. She's essentially literally accusing him of having blood on his hands. So these were the three that I thought we would find something in if there was going to be an indictment. I felt that those were one. It would be either one of those three. Well, I turned out to be right that it was Paul Manafort. I'm very disappointed in what we came out with. See, he's not in trouble because he got money from Russia or he was paid off by Russia in order to do something, to throw the campaign or to influence the campaign. Paul Manafort is essentially being indicted under tax evasion. We're giving him the Al Capone treatment. So on Monday, this article came out that said Paul Manafort and Rick Gates, who we'll get to in a little bit, both former campaign aides to Donald Trump, have been confined to their homes in Virginia as they await trials on a laundry list of felony charges. Manafort, a former Trump campaign chairman, is a veteran lobbyist now charged with conspiring against the United States and money laundering on a gigantic scale, following an investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller. Along with Gates, his longtime business partner and protege, Manafort surrendered to federal authorities early on Monday as the first charges from the probe of possible Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. presidential elections were unsealed. The indictment against Manafort, 68, and Gates, 45, include 12 separate criminal counts: conspiracy against the United States, conspiracy to launder money, unregistered agent of a foreign principal, false and misleading Foreign Agent Registration Act statements, false statements, and seven counts of failure to file reports of foreign bank and financial accounts. The government alleges that $75 million was moved by Manafort to offshore accounts without declaring the income to the government. From there, Manafort allegedly withdrew $18 million to fund a lavish lifestyle, and Gates is accused of pulling out another $3 million. So this is really the money that they're talking about, is that they took out this money from their foreign account. Well, they didn't move it they moved it off without informing, but then they took this money out and spent it without paying any taxes on it because the government wasn't aware of it. So tax evasion. That's it. At the end of a year-long investigation, we've got tax evasion. How disappointing. I've been losing faith inside this investigation as it's gone on. At first, I thought that there was a possibility of something being there. I kind of felt the same way my mother did on the subject. I asked her about it early on, and she said, I feel like where there's smoke, there's fire. And that's how I felt on the subject. We heard so much about it, and there was all this information and evidence relating Trump back to Russia and that there was Russian influence. Not really. Even the story about how the DNC got hacked and those emails got stolen, it was said that it was done by a hacker, Guccifer 2.0, and that he eventually relayed the information back to WikiLeaks, and that Roger Stone was in contact with Guccifer 2.0. But Guccifer 2.0 was being called a Russian spy, essentially, that he was one of the main architects of this misinformation media that happened during the election. At first, I was a little more inclined to believe it when I was researching this last time when I did my episode. I think that was like back in May of this year. I was a little more inclined to believe it. But as this has gone on and less has turned up, and something as important as Guccifer 2.0 got left behind, I started losing a lot of faith in this story. And I also started hearing about how many people are getting accused of being Russian spies or Russian hackers when they're not. They're just people. They're trolls or whoever, yet they're still being accused of being Russian spies and hackers. So this also started making me believe that Guccifer 2.0 may have been nothing more than a troll, a hacker. And then, 11 months after this investigation began, when there was all this evidence, tax evasion. Is there even anything there? Is there really even anything there? This is one of those situations that it's kind of like the whole conspiracy that about governments having UFOs is that, or NASA knowing about UFOs and aliens, I should say. They say that if NASA did find aliens, they would be shouting it because that would just mean a huge bump in budget for them. A lot more money go to NASA as they want an investigation into this alien life form. And it's the same thing with this. So many people are against Trump, and so much of the media is against Trump, that if there was anything, we would be hearing about it. So this is why I'm disappointed with how the investigation is gone. And it just brings me back to that video by Project Veritas from months ago where they exposed CNN and they ended up saying it's for ratings, and then I think Van Jones ended up saying that it's just a nothing burger. Kind of seems like it now. That was actually one of the big hits to my confidence on this subject, was that Project Veritas video, because it was just, to have one of the leading news sources in the nation, who are one of the people leading the charge on this whole Russia situation, to say it's a nothing burger and it's for ratings. The possible sentence, if found guilty, would be stiff. Up to 80 years in prison for Manafort and 70 for Gates, plus millions of dollars in fines. More typical federal sentencing for the crimes charged would be 10 to 12.5 years for Gates and 12.5 to 15 for Manafort. The indictment is purely focused on alleged financial crimes and does not include any charges related to the broader question that formed the basis of Mueller's investigation: whether Donald Trump's presidential campaign colluded with Russia to swing the 2016 election in his favor. It describes criminal allegations that predate the Trump campaign. Trump's name is not mentioned in the 31-page document. Oh boy. Not even a mention of Trump's name. That doesn't bode well for your investigation. Well, maybe it's not completely far gone, as we'll get to, because there was another person called George Papadopoulos who ended up getting arrested. So we'll see if there's something there. But right now, one of the main people that seem to be involved in the campaign has no connection to rushing with Trump. And this crime would not either, because it's just a tax evasion. So it'd all be what Gates and Manafort did, not what Trump did. We were starting off this investigation looking into Russia connection because they were meddling in the 2016 election. This should be the first arrest they make. Something related to this. Even when we look at Manafort's expenses, it's nothing that suspicious, really. Like, there are high amounts spent on some things, and in certain locations you wonder how somebody could spend that much money there. But it kind of makes sense if you look at it in some perspective. But he spent $5.43 million for home improvements in the Hamptons, $1.31 million for home improvements in Florida for home automation, lighting, and home entertainment. He spent over $900,000 in an antique rug store. So yeah, it's something like that. Like, how do you spend that much? Then again, if you're redoing all your homes, you may be buying a bunch of different rugs for all your homes. So if it's an antique rug store, those are expensive. Over $800,000 on men's clothing store in New York. And again, if you're spending a lot of money, you might be completely redoing your wardrobe of tailored suits in the finest material. So it'll be expensive. While these are large amounts, to me, it seems like a man who went on a crazy spending spree over anything. And the rest of it just seems to be the same sort of thing. A man buying himself a bunch of goodies after he made a shit ton of money. spending at a Beverly Hills clothing store, payments on 3 Range Rovers, a Mercedes-Benz, Florida art gallery, and New York housekeepers. So right now, Manafort is free on a $10 million bond and Gates agreed to a $5 million bond. Both will be on home detention as a condition of their release, and they have surrendered their passports. They are expected back in court on Thursday. So this indictment centered almost entirely around Manafort's alleged illegal lobbying and money laundering activities between 2006 and 2014, since Manafort's money source was the Ukrainian Party of Regions, which dissolved in 2014 with the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych. The indictment alleged that Manafort and Richard Gates III, his right hand, worked as unregistered agents of the government of Ukraine, generated tens of millions of dollars in income as a result for the Ukraine work. They then laundered the money through scores of United States and foreign corporations, partnerships, and bank accounts. Manafort and Gates didn't register as foreign agents, which they apparently were, and Manafort used his hidden overseas wealth to enjoy a lavish lifestyle in the United States without paying taxes on that income. The period of defrauding the government continued through 2017, according to the indictment. Between in or around 2008 and 2017, both dates being approximate and inclusive, Manafort and Gates devised and intended to devise and executed and attempted to execute a scheme and artifice to defraud and to obtain money and property by means of false and fraudulent pretenses, representations, and promises from the United States Bank and other financial institutions. They allegedly wired millions through other companies for purposes of laundering through 2014. Manafort also bought properties with offshore money in order to take loans against the property to boost his lifestyle. Some are suggesting that this indictment against Manafort and Gates, along with the heavy charges, is an attempt to put pressure on them both in order to give up information or people who would have more connection towards the Russian scandal. There's really one of two possibilities in this. They got desperate because it had been so long and they hadn't found anything, and they really just went after whoever they could. Or this is the case here, that they are trying to put pressure in order to find more. But if you ask me, both kind of reek a little bit of desperation. If it's the first one and it's just because they haven't made an arrest yet and haven't found much, then, well, that just has desperation written all over it. If it's the latter and they're trying to put pressure on Manafort and Gates to sing, that still shows that you don't really know that much or don't have that much. Now you've charged them with something that has very little to do with what you're investigating, and in fact is not even the main thing you are investigating. You're investigating collusion. And in your conclusion, the person you are trying to indict, his name doesn't even appear once in a 31-page document. And in fact, even we can look at some of the charges that were laid. Conspiracy against the United States, that's not a treason charge. That's actually a financial charge. So this will be something that anybody will face if they've conspired to launder money against the government. So don't take conspiracy against the United States as an actual conspiracy, like he was conspiring to rig the election and get Donald Trump put in place as a puppet for Russia. However, there was another arrest made. As I stated earlier, George Papadopoulos, ex-Trump aide who suggested meeting with Russians, pleaded guilty in Mueller probe. Now, this story does have a little more juice to it. Prosecutors describe how Papadopoulos held himself out to be the conduit between the Trump campaign and high-level Russian officials, including President Vladimir Putin. A former foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign admitted he worked with representatives of the Russian government during the campaign as he pleaded guilty in Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's probe into interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. George Papadopoulos, who has suggested that Donald Trump meet with top Russian leaders during the campaign, pleaded guilty on October 5th to making false statements during an interview with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Papadopoulos is cooperating with Mueller's probe, and his indictment lists an unidentified campaign supervisor who also was aware of that contact with the Russians. In a statement made of the offense made public on Monday in federal court in Washington, prosecutors describe how Papadopoulos held himself out to be a conduit between the Trump campaign and high-level Russian officials, including Russian President Vladimir Putin. Papadopoulos was one of 5 foreign policy advisors to the Trump campaign. An unidentified London professor who had made contact with Papadopoulos in 2016 claimed to have damaging information on Hillary Clinton, according to the court filing. The professor said he had substantial connection to Russian government officials. Papadopoulos met with the professor in London around March 21, 2016, prosecutors said. The professor brought with him a female Russian national introduced to Papadopoulos as a relative of Putin. 10 days later, the indictment said, Papadopoulos attended a national security meeting that included Trump. When introduced at the meeting, Papadopoulos said he had connections he could use to arrange a meeting between Trump and Putin, it said. That unnamed Russian national began communicating with Papadopoulos after the meeting. As mentioned, we are all very excited by the possibility of a good relationship with Mr. Trump, she wrote in an April 2016 email disclosed by the prosecutors. The Russian Federation would love to welcome him once his candidature would be officially announced. Also around that time, prosecutors said, Papadopoulos emailed a high-ranking official of the Trump campaign to discuss Russia's interest in hosting Mr. Trump. Have been receiving a lot of calls over the last month about Putin wanting to host him and the team when the time is right. Days later, Papadopoulos thanked the professor for his critical help in arranging a meeting between the campaign aides and the Russian government, saying, it's history-making if it happens. So that might be something. We may have something with this George Papadopoulos, some sort of connection. However, we don't really have a good timeline for what's going on. We kind of have roughly, they've met up here and here and here, but we don't really know what the whole details were. So we'll have to wait and see if anything else comes out of this. Because this seems to be at least communication with the Russians. Whether there's actual collusion that's taking place is interesting. Because as things stand, it doesn't seem like Trump actually met with any of these Russian officials, but it's all been Papadopoulos. And this is the problem in the investigation, is that people are willing to indict, but we need evidence of Trump meeting up with the Russians and planning this out. Because as far as we know, there was information that may have been grabbed. Possibly. I say possibly because we still don't know anything for fact. So what do you think? So far, after these arrests with Paul Manafort and George Papadopoulos, let me know in the comments below what you think about this Russian investigation at the moment. But through this, we've also been hearing a lot more about the Russia dossier. This is that Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Convention paid for research that led to the dossier. So in this report by the Washington Post, it states that the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee helped fund research that resulted in a now famous dossier containing allegations against President Trump's connection to Russia and possible coordination between his campaign and the Kremlin, people familiar with the matter said. Mark E. Elias, a lawyer representing the Clinton campaign and the DNC, retained Fusion GPS, a Washington firm, to conduct the research. After that, Fusion GPS hired dossier author Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer with ties to the FBI and the U.S. intelligence community, according to those people, who spoke on the condition of anonymity. Elias and his law firm, Perkins Coie, retained the company in April 2016 on behalf of the Clinton campaign and the DNC. Before that agreement, Fusion GPS's research into Trump was funded by an unknown Republican client during the GOP primary. The Clinton campaign and the DNC, through the law firm, continued to fund Fusion GPS's research through the end of October 2016, days before Election Day. The dossier has become a lightning rod amid the intensifying investigation into the Trump campaign's possible connection to Russia. Some congressional Republican leaders have spent months trying to discredit Fusion GPS and Steele and tried to determine the identity of the Democrat or organization that paid for the dossier. Some of the details are included in a Tuesday letter sent by Perkins Coie to a lawyer representing Fusion GPS, telling the research firm that it was released from a client confidentiality obligation. The letter was prompted by a legal fight over a subpoena for Fusion GPS's bank records. People involved in the matter said that they would not disclose the dollar amount paid to Fusion GPS, but that the campaign and the DNC shared the cost. Officials have said that the FBI have confirmed some of the information in the dossier. Other details, including the most sensational accusations, have not been verified and may never be. Fusion GPS's work researching Trump began during the Republican presidential primaries when the GOP donor paid the firm to investigate the real estate magnate's background. Fusion GPS did not start off looking at Trump-Russia ties, but quickly realized that those relationships were extensive, according to the people familiar with the matter. When the Republican donors stopped paying for the research, Elias, acting on behalf of the Clinton campaign and the DNC, agreed to pay for the work to continue. The Democrats paid for the research, including by Fusion GPS, because of concerns that little was known about the Trump and his business interests, according to people familiar with the matter. Well, I highly doubt it was because that little was known about Trump and his business interests. This was without a doubt going in to be a smear campaign. If it was a Republican who funded it beforehand, then it seems to me that it's most likely one of his candidates, one of his rivals, who either it was one that really pissed him off that was out early, or it was one of the late ones. Maybe it was Marco Rubio. The cat has returned for the rest of the podcast. But this sort of information you would go after as a smear campaign, so it's clear to me that this was more what it's supposed to be, not because they're just trying to get information into Trump and his business ties. There's a lot easier ways to go about it. The type of information that they got in this dossier just shows that this was not their real intention. This dossier was where the famous story you probably heard about of Donald Trump getting pissed on by Russian hookers. This was one of the wild allegations of the dossier that they were claiming. This is not the type of information you get when you're going after your business ties or business information. At no point, the people said, did the Clinton campaign or the DNC direct Steele's activities. They described him as a Fusion GPS subcontractor. The dossier was published by BuzzFeed News in January. Fusion GPS has said in court filings that it did not give BuzzFeed the documents. In early January, then FBI Director James B. Comey presented a 2-page summary of Steele's dossier to President Barack Obama and President-elect Trump. In May, Trump fired Comey, which led to the appointment of Robert S. Mueller III as special counsel investigating the Trump-Russia matter. Congressional Republicans have tried to force Fusion GPS to identify the Democrat or group behind Steele's work, but the firm has said that it will not do so, citing confidentiality agreements with its client. Last week, Fusion GPS's executives invoked their constitutional right not to answer questions from the House Intelligence Committee. The firm founder, Glenn Simpson, had previously given a 10-hour interview to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Over objections from the Democrats, the Republican leader of the House of Intelligence Committee, Representative Devin Nunes, California, subpoenaed Fusion GPS's bank records to try to identify the mystery client. Fusion GPS has been fighting the release of its bank records. A judge on Tuesday extended a deadline for Fusion GPS's bank to respond to the subpoena until Friday, while the company attempts to negotiate a resolution with Nunes. These reactions show of some suspicious activity. The first one would be that they invoked, I believe it is their Fifth Amendment right not to answer any questions. And that really is so you invoke your right because it says that you don't have to answer any questions that would incriminate you. So you really do only invoke it when you don't want to say something incriminating against yourself. So the fact that GPS executives invoked this right shows some suspicion. And then the reaction of the Democrats, how opposed they were to when they wanted to release Fusion GPS's bank records. If they have nothing to hide, then they should be willing to release them. But they're not. When you're mired this deep in the investigation and you're seen as one of the main people who caused this, refusing to release your bank records do not help your cause whatsoever, but in fact do the complete opposite and make you look guilty, as many people are probably seeing them. Republicans believe the dossier is a key part of the Trump-Russia story. After all, it involves a foreign intelligence agent, former MI6 Christopher Steele, digging dirt on Trump and Russia with possible ties to President Vladimir Putin. Democrats have not been very interested, preferring to focus on possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia and/or possible presidential obstruction of the collusion investigation. However, Fusion GPS has its own Russian ties as it stands. And there have been a few reports of people who said that they have been slandered against by Fusion GPS during certain situations. So as the article says, the witness was William Browder, the businessman who crusaded the passage for the Magnitsky Act, which imposed sanctions on Russia after the killing of an anti-corruption lawyer. The sanctions enraged Putin, who retaliated by blocking American adoption of Russian babies. Putin also retaliated by launching a campaign to undermine and ultimately repeal the Magnitsky Act. Among the Russians who took part in that campaign were Natalia Veselnitskaya and Rinat Amechkin, who just so happened to attend the June 9, 2016 Trump Tower meeting with Donald Trump Jr., but the larger effort was organized by the American firm Fusion GPS, which denied any role in the Trump Tower meeting but was a bigger part in the anti-Magnitsky Act campaign. As Browder testifies, he says, Veselnitskaya, through the law firm Baker Hostetler, hired former Wall Street Journal reporter Glenn Simpson to report Glenn Simpson of the firm Fusion GPS to conduct a smear campaign against me and Sergei Magnitsky in advance of congressional hearings on the Global Magnitsky Act. He contacted a number of major newspapers and other publications to spread false information that Sergei Magnitsky was not murdered, was not a whistleblower, and was instead a criminal, end quote. Browder was clear that he believed Russians paid Fusion GPS to conduct the anti-Magnitsky Act campaign, and of course, Fusion GPS is also behind the Trump dossier that left Republican Senator Lindsey Graham with lots of questions. The group that did the dossier on President Trump hired this British spy, wound up getting it to the FBI. You believe they were working for the Russians? And Browder answered, in the spring and summer of 2016, they were receiving money indirectly from a senior Russian government official. So even Browder himself, though, has admitted that he hasn't found any connection between Russian money to Fusion GPS on this point. So this whole theory about the involvement between the Democratic Party and the FBI is still just that. It's still a theory. But it seems very clear that there was a lot of lies told by the Democratic Party when they were asked about the Fusion GPS's funding report. So what sort of skeletons are lying in the closet for the Democratic Party in this whole situation? Because they themselves have connection back to Russia, and there's still the implication that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and the rest of the Democrats sold a shit ton of uranium to the Russians before Barack Obama left office, and also a few years in the past. So we can't put it past them because the Democratic Party seems to have connection to Russia, even though it seems like we also may have had some Republican connection to Russia. We're still going to have to wait to figure out what really comes out of this. But before we end off this episode, I also want to read this last part, that Fusion GPS also does not have the most credible and ethical track record. The firm is accused of spreading misinformation, disinformation, and smears by a Venezuelan journalist who claimed Fusion GPS tried to ruin him after he reported on a company that hired the firm, Fox News reported. The Venezuelan journalist Alec Boyd told Fox News that Fusion GPS labeled him as a pedophile, extortionist, and drug trafficker after he exposed corruption inside one of Fusion's clients. So whether this is true, we'll still have to wait to be seen, but Fusion GPS looks like they're in a pretty rough spot right now. They have their track record speaking for them, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today. I'm Adrian Lloyd. I'll see you soon.